Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to talk about the Russian Revolution and the rise of communism. Sorry, but there are quite a few terms for you to identify on this opening slide. There's quite a few terms I'd like you to be familiar with by the time we get to the end of this lecture. Also, there are a couple of questions that you should be able to answer by the time this lecture is over. So, let's get to it. We're going to start where we've left off in class, and that is with World War I. World War I was, in many ways, a watershed for Western civilization. That's because this war did more than kill tens of millions of people. It also completely reshaped the 20th century. How? A big part of that has to do with some of the ideas that we have been discussing throughout this semester. For much of our class, Western civilization has been gradually moving forward into a world that looks more and more like our own. When we started out, Western civilization was a world of feudalism, religious intolerance, and slavery. By the 20th century, however, we had left much of that behind. Western civilization was progressing both technologically with the Industrial Revolution and politically with the rise of democracy. But World War I is going to throw all of that into question. How could one who had witnessed gas attacks and battles on the Western Front that killed more than 1 million people believe that the world today was better off than it was yesterday? How could one believe in democracy? The democracies of Britain, France, and the United States had been just as enthusiastic for World War I as had been the conservative Germans, the Austrians, and the Russians. In fact, World War I is going to lead many to question the very idea of the Enlightenment. Before we answer that question, however, let's look over some of the isms that we have discussed in class so far. Before we answer that question, however, let's look over some of the isms that we have discussed in class so far. Liberalism, for example, was a belief in democracy and equal rights. It was based on the ideas of the Enlightenment and actually has this notion that government should interfere as little as possible in the lives of its people. Liberalism was a reaction to conservatism, which had argued that kings and queens knew best. As Metternich had said, kings are like fathers who rule in the best interests of their people. Socialism has a lot in common with liberalism, but to the idea of natural rights, socialists added a right to work. In other words, socialists argued that government should interfere in society to ensure fairness for the industrial working class. Toward the end of the 1800s, a new ism was introduced: communism. Now, communism is similar to socialism in its concern for the working class. In fact, many people confuse socialism and communism. But really, communism and socialism, while they share some things in common, they really are different. And let's try to understand that. Let's just do a simple side-by-side comparison of socialism and communism. Socialism meant government control and manipulation of some or all of the economy. Why? Well, the Industrial Revolution changed life for the working class. Socialists believed that government rules and regulations were needed to protect workers from working too many hours under unsafe conditions. Socialists also will argue that government should give people a job during times of economic distress. The goals were to reduce poverty among the working class and also to increase economic equality. In contrast, communism argues that government should do more than simply interfere in society and economics to ensure equality. Government should actually take over all private property. In other words, the government should own and operate the factories. So, to recap, what's the difference between socialism and communism? Private property will remain under socialism, but under communism, there is no private property. It's really that simple. Or, to put it this way, all communists are socialists, but not all socialists are communists. Now let's look a little bit at the history of communism. The father of communism is Karl Marx. We encountered Marx a few weeks back when we discussed socialism and the revolutions of 1848. Now, Marx originally was a socialist, but early on he decides that socialism does not go far enough to correct the problems of society. In 1848, the year that revolution breaks out across Europe, Marx will publish the Communist Manifesto. In it, he argues that the main conflict in society was not one of nations, but one of social classes. The two classes he identifies are the proletariat, or the working class, and the bourgeoisie. Now, the bourgeoisie is often called the middle class, but really what he's talking about here is the class that owns all of the factories and all of the property in society. In other words, when he talks about the bourgeoisie, he is talking about the wealthy class in society. Marx believed that ultimately workers would one day get so fed up with this system of being oppressed by factory owners, having to work too many hours for too little pay. They would ultimately get so fed up with being oppressed that they would rise up in revolution and seize control of the economy and the government. The slogan that comes out of Marxism is "Workers of the world, unite!" Well, now let's jump ahead about 50 years and shift our focus to Russia. Vladimir Lenin is a young Russian man, and he's an early follower of Marx. He grew to hate the Russian government, especially after his brother was executed for plotting to kill the Tsar in 1887. He began to plot a violent revolution that would overthrow the Tsar and install communism in Russia. His followers took the name Bolshevik, which means majority party. It was a name that he gave them in order to convince other people that more people actually supported the communists than they actually did. It's really kind of a bit of trickery here. He's trying to convince people that really the majority of the population supports communism. That really wasn't true. No matter what Lenin said, however, the task before him and his Bolshevik party was daunting. That's because Russia was really the last place where a communist revolution should have occurred. Had you asked Marx in 1898 or 1900, if he was still alive, if you had asked him where is a communist revolution likely to occur, he never would have said Russia. That's because Marx argued that a communist revolution could only happen when the industrial workers rose up and seized power for themselves. The problem for Russia was that it was one of the least industrialized nations in Europe. It was also one of the most oppressive societies, led by the most absolute of all Europe's absolute monarchs. We're talking about Tsar Nicholas II. So, what's going to happen? Essentially, World War I will happen. Russia is going to suffer one serious defeat after another at the hands of the Germans. The war, therefore, is going to become incredibly unpopular at home. By 1915, almost 2 million Russian people had been killed or wounded in the fighting. To make matters worse, the war drove up prices for food and fuel. This hurt peasants and industrial workers the most. Now, I want you to make a connection here. We've seen this before. Remember, the French Revolution in 1789 was preceded by food shortages. The revolution in 1848 in France and Germany and Austria and all across Europe, the revolutions of 1848 were also preceded by the Hungry 40s. In other words, food and fuel shortages. In Russia, these food and fuel shortages will first lead to unrest, and then later to strikes and work stoppages. Now, the army is called in to stop these things, but in reality, they're not able to do anything. Ultimately, these protests will turn into a revolution against the Tsar's government. In March of 1917, Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown, and Russia was declared to be a republic, in other words, a nation without a king. This revolution was led not by Vladimir Lenin, but by a young lawyer by the name of Alexander Kerensky. Kerensky had been highly critical of the Tsar's government, and he wants to institute liberal reforms in Russia. Let me repeat this point. Kerensky's Russian Revolution was a liberal revolution. I hope you know what that means. He's, for example, promising to give Russia a constitution, the first constitution in their history. He's also promising to write into that constitution protections for the natural rights of the Russian people. These are wonderful steps in the right direction, especially if you support liberal ideas, which most Americans really do. The problem is, Kerensky is going to make one very, very serious mistake. His mistake is that he is going to keep Russia in World War I. This means that the food and the fuel shortages will continue, the soldiers will continue to die on the front lines, and at home this is going to lead to more strikes and more protests, and it's going to turn Kerensky's government, it's going to make Kerensky's government highly unpopular. Guess who is going to be able to take advantage of the unpopularity of Kerensky, or his mistake to keep Russia in World War I? Of course, it's Vladimir Lenin. Lenin will use the unrest, the hatred of Kerensky and World War I to create another revolution. On October 24th, 1917, his communists, his Bolsheviks, will lead another revolution that will overthrow Kerensky and drive him from power. Unlike Kerensky, Lenin will understand that the biggest issue that Russia cares about in 1917 is the war. Thus, he will negotiate a peace settlement with Germany. That settlement will cost Russia huge chunks of territory. Yet, it's going to buy time for the communists to take over the entire country. In 1922, Lenin and his communists will have created the world's first communist state, which he calls the Soviet Union. Over the next 10 years, communists will move to take over all private property within the nation. They are also going to build one of the most oppressive and terrifying regimes in all of human history. So, in conclusion, what is the state of Western civilization after World War I? Well, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, there were serious questions about liberalism, democracy, and the Enlightenment. Folks were really questioning whether Western civilization was actually progressing or not. They were also questioning whether or not democracy, or whether or not the people could actually govern themselves. In many respects, these are the same questions that followed the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars a century earlier. Unlike 1814 and 1815, however, unlike the period after the Napoleonic Wars, however, there are new isms that are going to rise up to challenge liberalism. Specifically, we're talking about communism, which we explored in this lecture. But communism was not the only ism attracting new followers. Another was growing in Italy and especially Germany. That ism, known as fascism, would ultimately lead Europe into another war. But that's another subject for another lecture. Thank you.